If you ask any person what a monster looks like, you will receive a depiction of zombies, vampires, witches, and etc. Just look at what costumes people dress up in for Halloween. But what will be said next will alter your perception dramatically. Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, became famous of his seemingly strange experiment after Mossad, the National Intelligence Agency of Israel, according to the classified Operation Finale, after many futile attempts, in 1960 finally caught the Nazi Adolf Eichmann, responsible for the mass extermination of Jews during World War II, who was definitely hiding in Latin America, Argentina. The Nazi lieutenant colonel was in secret transported to Israel, where he was tried and hanged. During the trial, he kept repeating one infamous phrase, "I was just following orders." The psychologist Stanley Milgram decided to find out how people carried out the atrocious orders of that Adolf. As a result, the experiment unveiled much more, and it sent shivers down one's spine. There are three people: a scientist experimenter, an ordinary person who's been found on an ad that said that they're gonna be just a helper, and an allegedly random subject off the street who actually is a pre-trained actor. And the subject of the actual experiment is in fact the unsuspecting assistant. The actor always becomes, so to speak, a student, and the subject always becomes a teacher, and the experiment begins. It was billed as learning by punishment. But what really was going on in there? The person sits down to control the device, where there are a lot of buttons, from 15 volts to 450, from unpleasant muscle twitches to a torturous death. Each of these buttons allegedly shocks the actor close in the adjacent room with electricity if they answer a question incorrectly, while they made sounds of pain from the discharge. And the scariest thing is, people really shocked other people with electricity for incorrect answers. They didn't want to, they wanted to leave, and whenever that happened, they were just told the following sentences by choice. Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue. With each wrong answer, the force of the shock increased, and whenever it reached close to 450 volts, the actors stopped making sounds, pretending that they died. 2/3 of the participants maintained pressing the buttons, even if the person allegedly died and there was no answer.
Incorrect. You'll now get a shock of 75 volts. Soft hair. He kind of did some yelling in there. Continue, please. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. Wrong. Answer is day. 285 volts. Continue, please.
That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here.
The next phrase is
Let me
fast,
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
bird,
Let me
car, train, plane.
Continue, teacher. Go on, teacher. Here. 375 volts.
I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering on less voltage.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please. The 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
And it's not about some kind of profit, as they were told that in any case, even if they left, they would still be paid $4.5. It was in 1961, now it's about $46. People listened to usual orders like, you have no choice, go on. And they did go on. Their right request makes a murderer from a person, and as for me, it's very creepy. Though it's not the only thing that is. If you can't go through the door, try the window. If that doesn't work, try the roof. There is more than one way to get inside a person. Nora Roberts. Milgram's experiment shows that everything will work out as well if you instill a sense of inviolable responsibility.
I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow.
Let me
Dance.
out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me
You're
out.
responsible for it.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Which even at a subconscious level gives a feeling of impunity that slowly devours a person. Although, who knows, maybe already a monster. Or, for example, block any urge to rational thinking, to suggest you don't even have to understand the whole thing. You're just a helper. Do what the above scientist tells you.
I sure don't know the effect of this thing, and I'm a little skeptical about electricity.
The experiment requires that you go on, teacher. Please continue. I mean, then I think it's for somebody that knows a little more about this machine and stuff to say whether to go or not. That's why I asked the gentleman there, should I keep going?
On top of that, you can see him the whole time, encouraging you. Go on. You're doing well. You're murdering well. Similar experiments were carried out later in many countries, and they all gave a similar result. Yet still, some scientists refused to believe that Milgram's experiment wasn't rigged. So they followed his steps and conducted their own one. But it came out much, much worse. I'm sure you will like it much less. Charles Sheridan and Richard King took not an actor but a real puppy and connected real wires to it, through which this time real current passed. They assured all the subjects that it was a puppy training experiment. The subjects saw the puppy, they pressed the buttons, they saw it groaning in pain and jumping up from the sudden shocks. The subjects cried, they tried to leave, but whenever they heard the phrase that they had to continue, they continued shocking it with electricity. 54% of guys continued to the end. But girls, cute creatures, absolutely everyone pressed the button with the maximum charge. The current strength was reduced in advance, of course, so don't worry about the puppy. The shocks were non-fatal, but the subjects of the experiment didn't know about it. They just saw it suffering and kept pressing the buttons. In the original Stanley Milgram's experiment, the target was to explore at least one way of the Nazi Germany's psychological submission. So the main audience was white men, then women, then there were many experiments on people of other races, religions, and ages. What group of people do you think was the most noble? They all were easy to bend to submission. The results imply it's in the human nature. There's even a tendency to find this experiment based on inflicting pain funny.
Wrong. It's hair. 75 volts, Jim. You don't know.
Please continue.
Wrong. Volts. 135. Ants a woman.
Wrong. It's horse. 150 volts.
Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here.
He's
I told you I
quit.
had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please. My heart's starting to bother me. I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Continue, teacher, please. Go on.
Yes, the results are sure shocking in both meanings. The level of control is 3 times as great as when the experimenter is present and visible than if they give orders more remotely, like by phone. Some might think that such effectiveness rate was achieved because it was at Yale University, which is regarded with respect and awe. For those Stanley Milgram prepared an answer. He purposely moved the experimental conditions to a somewhat run-down office building in an industrial town. The obedience somewhat dropped, but not significantly, so one doesn't even need the authority of Yale University. In another interesting modification, one more actor was taken, and the job of pushing the switch to shock the learner was theirs, while the subject was staying close. And what you think? Here, only 3 out of 40 thought of the ethics, and when the victim was placed far in some other room and cannot be heard or seen, the sole question arose. Did at least someone realize what they were doing? After all, the buttons were assigned.
435 volts. Says danger, severe shock here. Next 6 on the next one.
Continue, please.
435 volts.
So a reverse experiment was conducted. Get ready. Now the victim was placed in the same room as the subject, only half feet from them, with one exception. The victim only received a shock when his hand rested on a shock plate. The poor man kept wailing in pain, and at the 150 volt level, he would ask to be let free and refused to place his hand under the shock plate whatsoever. Then the experimenter would order the subject to force the victim's hand under the plate, and people really took his hand and forcefully pressed it against the plate. Upon the order to continue, they continued, punishing for incorrect answers. Now try picturing the whole scene. If an anonymous experimenter, one human they'd seen for the first time ever, within 5 minutes could successfully command adults to literally torture a 50-year-old man with poor health and weak heart against his screams from pain, one can only wonder what government, with its vastly greater authority and prestige, can command of its subjects. And this, in my opinion, is truly bone-chilling. However, that's far from the only ways to make humans inhuman. In 1971, the US Office of Naval Research provided funding to Stanford University psychologist Philip Zimbardo for conducting his Stanford Prison Experiment, which would later become the most famous psychology study ever. He and his colleagues created a life-size mock-up of the prison in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Department building. 24 physically and mentally stable students with no history of crime or drug abuse were chosen through an ad and promised $15 a day for a 2-week experiment. Converting to today's money, it's $112 a day for just playing a game. A game of guards and prisoners. The 24 volunteers were randomly divided into guards and prisoners. If only they'd known what that psychology game would have led to. The latter were unexpectedly taken into custody right at their home, put on a bag over their heads, and placed in prison, where they were supposed to be throughout the entire experiment. And the former were instructed to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison, while the researchers observed the subjects through a system of hidden cameras and microphones. Zimbardo gave out uniforms and chains, allowed prisoners' relatives for a visit, invited a Catholic priest, convened a mock parole board. Everything to make it all insanely realistic on purpose. Now it's already clear, the task was to cut them off from the real life. And it didn't take much. Already on the 6th day, the experiment went completely out of control and had to be terminated. So what had been happening within those walls during these 6 appalling days? From the very beginning, the prisoners were taunted with insults and petty orders. They were given pointless and boring tasks to do. At 2:30 a.m., prisoners were awakened from sleep by blasting whistles for the first of many counts, which weren't really needed. The guards had to wear sunglasses not to make eye contact with the prisoners, who had to be referred to by their number only. And in order to make them look the same, they were made to wear women nylon stockings over their heads, all in order to make them feel like non-humans, and it turned out surprisingly easy to accomplish. One of the guards stepped on the prisoners' backs while they were made to do push-ups, or made other prisoners sit on the fellow prisoners' backs doing their push-ups. For guards, it seemed to help to maintain order, but the prisoners saw it the other way around. Having ganged up already on a 2nd day of the experiment, the prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds against the door, and started shouting curses. The guards quelled the uprising, retaliating by using fire extinguishers which shot a stream of skin-chilling carbon dioxide. At this point, things exponentially started becoming especially uglier and uglier. The wardens generally began to harass and intimidate the prisoners. They were forbidden to use the bathroom, instead had to use buckets in the cell. Soon the guards stopped emptying the buckets as well, all of which was conceived as a good deed, a punishment. As the prisoners became more submissive, the guards became more aggressive and assertive, demanding ever greater obedience from the prisoners. Some of which broke down sobbing, some were screaming and cursing that seemed wild, and some were uncontrolled crying. Do you think that stopped anyone? One of the guards interviewed later confessed, "I made them clean the toilets out with their bare hands. I practically considered the prisoners cattle." And this is what gives chills in this nightmare. Not long ago they were in the same boat, all being normal students, and it had been only 6 days before the absolute emotional breakdowns of the prisoners and brutal aggression of the guards. It wasn't until this point that the psychologist realized they had to let them out. Philip Zimbardo himself participated in the experiment as the head of the prison, and later was shocked himself how quickly he naturally stopped noticing soulless violence from his subordinates. Subsequently, his experiment received a flurry of criticism and accusations of encouraging the guards to act tough. But even if, let's say, it was so, that still doesn't change the fact that normal people, having been deliberately put in harsh circumstances, can become monsters way quicker than we would like to believe. People start losing it. It ceases to be important whether you really are their judge and whether they're really guilty. They profoundly begin to believe that this is how it should be. They are the wardens, and those are just some prisoners. Think about what could have been done if the guards were purposely chosen mentally unstable psychos. Just create the right situation and add a little bit of authority. Authority. Generally, one of the most authoritative professions is that of a doctor. They're obedient to listen to, their verdicts are waited for, their orders are carried out and not discussed. In 1966, Charles Houghlin conducted an experiment where the participants had no idea they were in an experiment. The point is, in one hospital, nurses and graduate students were asked the question: what would you do if the head doctor called you during the shift and prescribed a new unfamiliar drug to a patient in the amount of 20 milligrams when it says on it that the maximum dose is 10? Anyone understands what a double overdose can lead to, so understandably everyone replied that, of course, they wouldn't have obeyed. Only that was just the beginning, and the experiment went on. In another real hospital, 22 nurses, unaware that they're being tested, received a phone call from the head physician on their evening shift and were told to take the drug and administer it to the sick. And this is where everyone was shocked. 21 of them did administer that drug because they didn't want to contradict their superior, and only one refused to do it. The drug wasn't even included in the medication list. The call came from a doctor unknown to them, and yet it happened as it happened. But of course it wasn't a drug, just a harmless chemical compound, so no one died. And now if you haven't fully understood the horror of that situation, one person out of malice could kill absolutely all the patients in the hospital, and would have done it not even with their own hands. However, there is one type of the experiment that's creepy in its own way. Vladimir Demiko, a Soviet scientist, an organ transplantation pioneer, in 1954 created, how would one call it if one wouldn't become a stutterer for the rest of one's life if unexpectedly saw it? A dog monster. He transplanted the head and paws of a puppy onto the neck of an adult German Shepherd. For all time, he created about 20 such creatures. Imagine what it's like to see this somewhere in the woods at night. Both heads could even lap up water at the same time. They, of course, didn't live long. The record was a month, but it was enough to put the USSR ahead in a race in medicine. Folks reacted differently. For many, such experiments seemed spine-chilling. And it was only before his death that it became indisputably clear that he'd made an invaluable contribution to heart transplantation. Remote control of a person and their thoughts. Admit, it sounds like a theme for a fantasy movie. After all, it's scary enough to imagine that someone will control you without your knowledge. Now imagine this is not a work of fiction. In 1963, the professor of physiology Jose Delgado of Yale University conducted one very frightening experiment. The scientist stood in a closed arena with an angry bull. The bull, of course, rushed at him. But the scientist pressed one button and the bull stopped for some reason. Pressed another one, the bull turned around and went away. What happened? You probably think it's some kind of yarn. If you don't believe, links to all the materials are down in the description. The fact is that the bull was implanted with electrodes directly into specific areas of its brain and stimulated through a radio signal. When the bull rushed at him, he targeted the bull's amygdala region, the region associated with aggression and fight-or-flight responses. The bull didn't even feel pain, nothing. Only an intrusive thought urge to change its mind that feels like one's own. The same experiments have been carried out on primates and even humans suffering from schizophrenia and epilepsy. The scientists believe that this is the future, that we need it. Perhaps it is, but many consider such experiments monstrous. After all, imagine the very idea that someone is controlling you and you don't even suspect it, thinking that these are your thoughts and decisions. Isn't it horrifying? Maybe the future really is as we're shown in the cyberpunk movies, because you cannot stop such scientists. Like Jose Delgado said before his death. Can you avoid knowledge? You cannot. Can you avoid technology? You cannot. Things are gonna go ahead in spite of ethics, in spite of your personal beliefs, in spite of everything. But all these experiments pale in comparison to the Nazis' ones, delving into which even the most blood-curdling horror movies will become comedies for you until the end of your days. Look, this monster's name is Joseph Mengele, or the Angel of Death, and this Nazi SS physician conducted just inhuman experiments on humans. Can you see a note of madness in it? You can. It's because I told you, and it's because it's such a photograph. In real conditions though, you will never be able to distinguish a human from a monster, because they look the same.